Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the RCI GDAS webinar. It is titled Service Planning. It will be presented today by Catherine Ivey. She is the Director of Community Services with the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities. Before we get started, let's cover a few conference details. If you have a question during the conference, we ask that you type in the question. Catherine is going to do her best to answer the questions as we go along. If not, all questions will be answered at the end of the conference. Also, if you are at your own computer station, a post-test survey will pop up at the end of the webinar. There will be 10 questions about the webinar and personal information questions such as name and email address that will enable me to send you your certificate. If you are not at your own computer, copy down the link that is posted on the last slide of this presentation. Use that link at your own computer to complete the post-test. I will send certificates to you within 1 week after the closing of the test. Please complete the post-test before January 17th to receive your certificates. We are now ready to begin. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you. Thanks, Elaine.
You're welcome.
And welcome, everybody. Good morning, everybody. I am going to, just as Elaine said, I'm going to kind of watch the screen for your questions throughout because I would really prefer that this be interactive if at all possible. So let's do our best to make a webinar interactive. I'm going to start at the beginning of this conversation with actually beginning at the beginning. Most of you are going to say and going to think, why is it that in a conversation about developing a care plan, we're actually going to talk about assessment? Can you see the screen? Can you see the slides on the screen that I'm putting up?
Catherine, right now it's still on the phone one. Hit that next button at the bottom.
I did. So that's my concern. Is that
okay, well, I tell you what. There you go.
You on now?
Yeah, we can see it now.
Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and start at the beginning, which is really talking about care planning from the initial phase. I'm going to use an analogy just because we're all freezing to death right now. And my analogy is this. If you start the discussion of care planning without first talking about the assessment, which is actually where you get your information to develop a plan of care, it's a bit like going swimming without putting your bathing suit on first. You can do it, but it's not advisable. It's not going to be comfortable, and you're not going to have the best ability to do your best in this process unless you begin at the beginning. So here's why we start with assessment. If you begin with a good assessment, and it doesn't have to be one, it can be a couple of assessments, what that does is it helps you begin to formulate what the complex care needs are of the individual. So from the very beginning, you use a good assessment to identify the problems and the strengths of the individual for the purpose and the intent of care planning. It allows you to monitor so that from time to time, from any point in time to another, you can see your attempts to meet the care needs and your outcomes and whether or not you were successful in matching or meeting your outcomes. It also provides a baseline of the individual's needs so that over time you can sit with that individual and look at them as a person and see whether or not they're improving or whether or not their condition may be declining. And so that's the other reason to use a real good assessment. So in the very beginning, you're going to use an assessment to decide on a plan of treatment. You're going to base your interventions, the services that the individual may need, all on this assessment. And it measures the effectiveness over time of an intervention. You're going to look at, through an assessment, you're going to begin to think about specific therapies or the best place for an older person to live or the best services that may reduce the risk. And in public settings, what the assessment does is it provides the basis for eligibility for care. all the time that you are assessing an individual and you're developing a plan of care, you're thinking about evaluating that service and the effectiveness of the service. And so essentially that becomes the basis of your plan of treatment, your plan of care. They're called they're named various things in various programs and various settings. What we're going to refer to it today as a plan of care. You'll also hear it called a support plan. Some systems call it a service plan, but we're going to refer to it as a plan of care. When you assess the needs of older adults or any people, what you're looking at is the basic biopsychosocial assessment, but also adding in cultural factors, spiritual factors, environmental factors, all kinds of things. And probably in a strengths-based model, the most important thing is you're establishing the client's perception of the need. I just want to make absolutely sure that everybody can hear me. I'm not on a speakerphone. I'm on a traditional phone. I'm seeing some folks are having difficulty hearing. So I
can hear you fine, Catherine. So I don't know if it's on their end or what the situation is, but I've had no problems with the sound coming in and out. So
okay, I'm going to hold the phone just a little bit closer and see if that helps a little bit.
Okay, because like I said, I can hear you fine.
Okay. So in assessing the older adult or any adult, you're going to establish the client's perception of the need, particularly in a strengths-based model. You're going to look at the importance of the client's environment in addition to the client's functional needs, and that's going to be the basis of determining whether or not you need to get collateral information. If you begin to think in the process of assessment that the information that you're getting is probably not completely accurate, then you're going to use that assessment to determine who in the person's circle of support may be able to provide additional history or additional information that you may need to complete the assessment and ultimately the plan of care. You're going to look for factors such as if the client seems to be withholding information, if the observable function of the individual just doesn't match what they're saying they can or can't do. And you're going to begin in some cases during the assessment to suspect a cognitive impairment that you didn't know about when you first began the assessment. And all of that is going to be extremely helpful in determining the plan of care. So think about this as a process. And each process really can't go forward until the origination is taken care of. So in the slide that I've just put up, what it really does is it talks about it really speaks to the interplay of the case management tasks. So beginning with the assessment, you use all of that information to develop your plan of care, and then periodically to evaluate the plan of care and to tweak your assessment a bit. Every time that you evaluate the plan of care, every time that you speak to the individual, what you're really doing is a mini assessment. You may not pull out a formal assessment tool, but you're reevaluating your assessment. So it is a living, breathing thing, this function that we call case management, that doesn't really have a beginning and an ending. You're also looking to see always what your evaluation is going to be. And the evaluation may refer to a particular service, or it may refer to a complete reassessment if you find that the individual, as you first knew him or her, is not the same individual that you're seeing as your relationship continues and as your relationship becomes a little deeper with that individual. The case manager or the care manager may or may not be involved with service coordination, and I think that that's an important point to point out. Those of us who've spent most of our careers in the public sector think of a very active involvement in case management. In fact, my friends who provide private care management have a level of involvement with the client or the family only insofar as the client or family choose to have them involved. And so your tasks that you may perform are going to be in a private setting, just exactly what the family needs you for, no more, no less. And regardless of who initiates the services, continual evaluation of the plan is critical because that's what's going to provide you with opportunities to correct the plan of care throughout. As we look at the next slide, what I wanted to point out is a problem-centered approach versus a strengths model. Most of us who have been in this business for a while are functioning largely on a problem-centered approach. And that's fine. I think it has its place, but a problem-centered approach really focuses on functional impairment of the individual. It identifies risk areas from those functional impairments, as opposed to a strengths approach, which really starts with the client's perception of his or her strengths, the perception of his or her needs. It focuses on the individual's coping skills or resilience, and it identifies environmental resources that enhance functioning. In addition to environmental resources, you take into account the social resources, the interpersonal resources, the intrapersonal resources. I think that the point here is that there's room for both approaches, and we're going to actually play with this a little bit later in the presentation. We're going to have some fun with this. But if you begin with thinking about the client's perception of the problem or need, what you're doing is you're listening for the client's language. Does the client use the word problem, or does the client seem to want to tell you what he or she can do and does well? Use that to your advantage in creating a plan of care. What you may at times have to do is use the opposite approach, and I'm going to give you an example of that. What you're trying to do is create a well-rounded perception of the situation. So if a client who appears to be very functionally impaired continues to downplay the functional impairment and even a little bit aggrandize what he or she is able to do, what you might say is something like, I really appreciate your independence, and it seems to be a strong trait of yours. It seems to be that you have immense coping skills and you've learned how to figure out your functioning. But I'm concerned about the falls that you've had over the last few weeks. Let's talk about some issues related to those falls. What you're doing there is you're trying to insert a bit of reality into the client's perception that they're doing just fine. So that's an example of where you're going to use the opposite model from what the client is telling you about his or her strengths or risk areas. If the client focuses conversely only on the problems, then what you might do is use the opposite model for that and point out the client's strengths. And I know we've all worked with folks who have told you, who have been prepared to tell you every single thing that they can't do. And this is a really good time for you to point out those strengths that the client has. Point out things that the client can do. You might say something like, I notice that you have difficulty with cleaning, but your apartment looks spotless. Tell me what tasks you do. It looks like you dust. It looks like you can vacuum. Tell me how you're getting these things done. And so what you're doing is you're building a coping mechanism and you're building coping skills and resilience and strength by doing that. Also, in using the strengths-based approach, what you're doing is you're providing for the most frugal use of formal supports by challenging the client about what he or she really needs to be safe. You're thoroughly integrating informal support by recognizing what role the client's current informal supporters have. And you're enhancing the well-being, you're affirming the person as competent, and you're probably most importantly, you're placing the locus of control on him or her. So let's go on to the next slide then. Excuse me just a minute, I'm having trouble forwarding the slides. Here we go. This is generally, this slide depicts the difference between our language when we use a problem-centered approach versus a strengths-based approach. And what I want to focus on are those bullet points that are in red, because those are really specific to developing a plan of care. In personal goal planning, what you're doing versus developing a plan of care as the expert is you're letting the client set out his or her particular goals, and the plan of action is developed using both of your resources to take those goals and work backward toward what do you need to reach those goals. The difference between setting up services versus resource acquisition, again, is based on a locus of control. So if you break long-term goals down into short-term tasks and you assign responsibility, and then you look at those tasks as needing to have gaps filled, what you're doing is you're going about the business of working with the client to negotiate with service providers. And you're negotiating and helping him or her negotiate with service providers about what he needs, what informal support is available, what he may need additionally from informal support. And then finally, you're collaborating with the individual. And you're collaborating based on the individual tasks listed and how they're carried out. You can reevaluate goals with the individual and reevaluate tasks as needed. But the collaboration is just to say that it's not a care plan review that's done as with the care manager as the expert, but rather it's a collaborative process that uses the client and the care manager as a team or as a partnership to develop how well the service plan is working. I decided to use an assessment tool to get us started on an example. And this assessment tool is one that's familiar to probably most people on the call. It's the determination of need, and essentially what it is it's a basic ADL, IADL inventory. The nice thing about this ADL, IADL inventory that I probably like the best is that it also takes into consideration informal support or coping skills of the individual about how the level of impairment is mitigated. And so if we look at this tool, and this would be a traditional Likert scale tool, it's a traditional problem-based tool, and it's an assessment used for care planning. But you can turn this around into a strengths model, and that's really what I wanted, because this whole workshop is about strengths-based care planning. That's how I want to use this assessment tool for just a minute and engage you in this. As you interview the client, all of these questions are going to meant to provide a reasonable picture of daily functioning. As you ask these questions, you can turn this into a strengths-based model by asking open-ended questions such as, if the individual has an impairment with bathing and has an unmet need for care, you might say to that individual, how have you been managing this? Tell me how you do this. And what you'll tease out of the individual at this point is the fact that though they may have a level of impairment with bathing, they found a way to cope with that level of impairment. And you're going to learn what their coping style is in asking those open-ended questions. You can ask questions like, who helps you with this? What else does that person do? So you can not only make this a strengths-based assessment, but you can get a lot of information from this assessment just by asking open-ended questions related to these ADLs and IADLs. It provides a lot of information about how clients have developed adaptive or coping skills, what resources they've found all by themselves, who they use in their communities to help them, and all manner of information. Now, the other thing that I want us to think about in thinking about how you begin to develop a plan of care is that even though an individual may have a functional impairment, they may have mitigating aspects of their other functional domains in life or their environmental domains in life that may mitigate those things. So if we look, for example, at this slide, what we see is that this individual, if you think about the minus signs indicating a functional impairment and the plus signs indicating functional capacity, what we've done is we've begun to take that ADL-IADL assessment and we've begun to move that into a plan of care with a goal on the outside of that, on the far right-hand side. So if you look at the fact that this individual has some functional impairment with bathing and with walking or ambulation, some of the things that you might look for as a goal if you switch to the far right column is 0 falls. That's a pretty easy goal to monitor. And then you sort of move back into the formal or informal service that is available or that can be set up, and you can begin to think about how it is you want to design your care plan. So with regard to functional impairment in bathing and ambulation, you might think about whether or not the individual could benefit from a physical therapy consultation. You might think about whether or not the person might benefit from an evaluation for adaptive or assistive devices in help with bathing or ambulation. That may be as far as you need to take this care plan. It may not require, in the long term, human intervention at this point, but may be quite nicely satisfied with some adaptive equipment. Similarly, if you've used this assessment tool with open-ended questions in the way that we just talked about in looking at the assessment, you might say to the individual, I see that you have difficulty in bathing. Tell me what that means to you. Tell me how you bathe. I'd like you to describe that, and also describe to me if you've ever had any real difficulty, such as falls, or have you slipped, or have you not been able to bathe for days at a time because your functional status was not as good on those days. And through that, what you can begin to get is an idea and a sense of where the greatest risk areas are within the person's environment. Often you'll find that the bathroom or the kitchen or the hallway or the stairway is not very well equipped to reduce the risk that's posed by the functional impairment. So again, your goal at that point would be to reduce the environmental risks back to your goal of 0 falls. And your formal services that you've noted under the functional status deficit are just as valuable here under the environmental deficit, and that's that you're going to ask a physical therapist to come in and evaluate the environment and see if there's any adaptive equipment for the bathroom or any modifications that need to be made. In terms of informal support, you may find that there is absolutely no risk at all in this case of informal support not being available. You're seeing that, in fact, you've got informal support who helps with shopping, who helps with probably trips to the physician. So in that case, your goal really as a care manager is just going to be to evaluate the informal supporter's ability to continue, their level of commitment to this, their level of stress related to this, etc. The one thing that you're going to find with regard to cognitive status, and we're going to come back to this in a minute, is that cognitive status can be the biggest mitigator of other risks that an individual can have in a particular domain area. And so in relation to the cognitive status, someone who has pretty severe functional impairment and who has excellent coping skills, you may find that that's quite enough, that individual has developed a coping mechanism because of their lack of cognitive impairment and because their cognitive status is just quite good. And we're actually going to talk about a case study in a few minutes that is the best example I could think of from my past care management experience of this situation. In terms of social functioning, our fictitious client here is isolated, and she's identified that herself as problematic. She has identified the fact that she rarely leaves the home except to shop once a week or so, or once every other week, and go to the doctor. And so she's requested, her goal is contact. She wants additional social support. And so one service that you might put in place to try to mitigate that for the short term is telephone reassurance. And so there again, you're looking at what the risk is, what she's identified as a problem, what her goal is, and then you're working back to think about a potential service that could mitigate and move her toward that goal. That would be a short-term goal that you might tweak as time goes on, because if you look up above, what we've done is we've put in place some physical therapy and an evaluation for adaptive devices, which may mean that over time you can actually amend that goal to the place where her goal becomes getting out of the house twice a week or once a week or whatever would be her goal. And she may be able to accomplish that based on some of the functional status risks that you've identified and dealt with in this plan of care. And then finally, her values and preferences always have to be considered. So you're asking her, will you accept the above services that we've talked about? Does this seem like something that you would find helpful? Because if the answer is no, then she's not going to participate in the plan of care. She's not going to accept it, and it's doomed to fail before it even begins. And so that's the reason always to evaluate her preferences, her goals, make this plan about her, our consumer, our client. In the next slide, what I wanted to do for y'all, it's a bit busy, and I'm going to explain it to you so that you understand my point here, and that is that any one of these domains in your assessment or in your plan of care can mitigate one or the other. So poor functional status can be mitigated by really strong social support networks. Poor functional status can be mitigated by an environment that has been adapted to reduce the risk to the lowest common point. Cognitive status, as I said before, always mitigates functional impairment. And then finally, the one that I wanted to mention to you is income and assets of the individual trump everything in terms of mitigating risk. I always say to folks, with enough money you can buy anything you need pretty much. And so with enough income and assets, one can modify the environment to the point where they can be safe. One can purchase services as the individual needs. And so that's always an important mitigating factor. But very few of us have unlimited income and assets, so you use that to the extent that it can be used. The other thing that I want to mention to you is that social functioning and psychological status are often overlooked as mitigating factors. And what I mean by that is that an individual who may be quite impaired and who is depressed is less likely to be able to take advantage of other factors that would mitigate risk, and is much less likely to be able to take advantage of opportunities and be able to participate actively in the plan of care development and in the plan of care implementation. And so psychological status probably should be looked at very carefully in the first assessment, just so that you can sort of get a feel for how participatory the individual can be or will be in development of the plan of care and in carrying out the plan of care. Here's our example, and this is an example of an individual who is really very, very impaired, but an individual who finds a way around that. And she is a 73-year-old divorced woman who lives in a high-rise apartment building, and her primary diagnosis is rheumatoid arthritis. Now, her age shouldn't deceive you because she's been diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis for quite a long time. And she's found many ways to cope with the rheumatoid arthritis and the resulting disability that she suffers from that. She has significant joint changes in her hands and feet that impair her functioning. And Mrs. Stevens in this case is a college graduate. She worked for many years in a library. She continues to be an avid reader, and she has 2 adult children who live in different cities. So as you look at this lady, you find that she has no cognitive impairment. She has good social support, but they happen to live very far away, and so it is reduced somewhat by the fact that they're not close by. And most importantly, what you need to know about this lady is that she's found ways to cope as her condition has deteriorated, as her functional status has deteriorated. So as we look at the next challenge, this in our knowledge of Ms. Stevens, what's happened with her is that she comes to an impasse, and that impasse is often in the form of a functional impairment that's new or that has deteriorated over time, and the impairment has actually increased. So what she's gotten for quite a long time is home-delivered meals, and she gets attendant care 3 times a week. And for a long time that worked well for her, but here's the new challenge at this point. She has increasing disability in the use of her hands because of the rheumatoid arthritis. And she believes that very soon she's going to be unable to toilet independently because of the disability and the deformities in her hands. She knows that once she's unable to toilet independently, it's going to jeopardize her ability to remain independent in her apartment, because that's the one thing that has to occur frequently throughout the day, obviously. And she, quite honestly, there's not enough in terms of resources to buy her or to provide for her 24-hour care in her apartment, and she's desperate to stay in her apartment. And so the way that this progresses is that if we, again, look at Ms. Stevens and her ability to cope, we begin to wonder what services could be added to this plan of care that could fully utilize or fully explore any options for her, any mechanical options, any medical equipment options, etc. So what do? We ask for a physical therapy consultation and an occupational therapy consultation. We add that to our plan of care because of this new challenge and the fact that this new challenge may well completely decrease her ability to be able to live independently. So I'm going to skip ahead and tell you what the ultimate outcome was. She and the care manager asked for a physical therapy consultation. It was an occupational therapy consultation. This occupational therapist engaged Ms. Stevens in really enhancing her own coping skills and thought through with her what devices might be available if she loses function of her hands to help with toileting. The occupational therapist and she discovered that she could actually have a bidet installed in place of her traditional toilet in this high-rise apartment building, and they had to collectively petition the building management for this modification in her bathroom in the high-rise apartment building. Next came a problem with the cost of the bidet. It was going to be about $500. Obviously, most public programs aren't going to pay for that, although some might. They weren't able to discover one that would. And so they went back together to her children, her adult children, who were more than happy to chip in $250 each for the purchase and the installation of the bidet. So this small thing, although it seems very small, allowed Ms. Stevens to continue to live independently for a number of years beyond those that she would have been able to live independently had that technology not been available. And so it's just a great, true example of an individual who had fabulous coping skills, who was determined, who had great intelligence, and was able to actively engage in trying to sort this next big problem out to her benefit. So now we're going to talk a little bit about care planning with a couple or an individual in a family, because it does have nuances. When you are developing a plan of care for two individuals or individuals who may live together in a partnership relationship, regardless of what that is, there are nuances about developing a plan of care that have to do with the amount of informal support that's available. And I know that we can never assume that informal support is available just because you live with other people, but a certain amount of that is true just because of the nature of humans living together. So again, if we take this from a strength perspective, what we remember is that when you're looking at a collective living environment, regardless of what that is, you need to assess each individual for the strengths and the challenges based on the team approach. So you're looking at it in terms of team competence rather than individual competence. You're going to look for the collective. And again, another good example of this from my own past is a couple who were both 84. One had moderate dementia, but was very physically fit, was quite ambulatory, could follow directions, enjoyed helping around the house, but had to be directed. The female version of this team had severe osteoporosis. She had great functional impairments, but she had a history of several vertebral fractures. She was able to walk, but she was very slow in that. She used a wheel walker, but she was cognitively very intact. Her coping skills were excellent. She managed the finances. She arranged all of the physician visits and the physician care appointments. And what she did over time was she developed a mechanism to direct her husband in the tasks that required physical dexterity. And she developed a method that she called talking him through it. And for those of you who have worked in dementia care, what you know is you have to break the tasks down into small little subtasks that the individual can hold on to long enough to carry them out. And that is exactly what Emily had done over time, because she realized that she couldn't give her husband a series of tasks all at the same time. She had to ask him to do one thing at a time. So when I met this couple, I was able to observe her, and she would say to him, "Now, Leon, I need for you to go in the kitchen." And then once he was in the kitchen, she would say to him, "Now, Leon, open the refrigerator and look for the milk." And sometimes she would have to direct him on what the milk looked like. But once there, he was able to bring her the milk or put it in a glass, but she talked him through those tasks, and she broke them down into little sub-parts that he could carry through with. And so in this particular case, I think what we're seeing an example of is just incredible strengths of this couple, not individually, but the fact that they lived together, they relied on one another, they had developed a collaborative team coping mechanism, and it worked really quite well for them. So if you think about these two case studies, what do they have in common? both of these have in common the fact that clients with good problem-solving skills and positive coping skills can really accomplish a great deal. That is that their functional impairments or their functional status would make you believe at first glance that they couldn't. So essentially, our task as care managers, as we develop plans of care, is to evaluate not only the strengths and the challenges of the clients, but what their coping skills, what their problem-solving skills are, what they have historically used for problem solving, and then to enhance those coping or problem-solving skills and to coach them in how well their problem-solving skills are working so that eventually we work ourselves out of a job. We go away and they're quite capable of managing their own everyday tasks. In terms of the next slide, what we're talking about in specifically developing the plan of care is that all of these domains, the functional strengths, the environment, the formal support, all lead to the development of the plan of care. I want you to notice where the goals are in this equation. I had a hard time deciding whether or not we should include level of risk as the most important or the client's individual goal as the most important. And I toyed with one or the other, but for most of us, what we first look at is the level of risk that this human being in front of us is involved in. What level of risk do their impairments pose for them in day-to-day life? And that, along with their personal goals, drive the care planning process. So we're looking at the capacity of informal supporters, potential services, what the implementation is going to look like, preferences, and the willingness. But first and foremost, we're looking at the level of risk and the goals. The last thing that I want to mention to you all before we open this up for questions and your response and just some conversation is task assignment. In a strengths-based model, what we look at always is who's going to do it. When you're developing a plan of care, what you put on that service plan or what you indicate as needed services is no more or less important than the who's going to do it, who's going to carry it out. So when it comes to developing a plan of care, you're not only going to indicate that you want to order an occupational therapy consultation with follow-up visits, but you're also going to decide how that's going to be done. And we just finished talking about and having a conversation about problem solving and teaching problem solving. One of the kindest and most illustrative things that you can do with the folks that you work with is to help them understand how to accomplish these things themselves. So with regard to ordering an occupational therapist, most of us are in a big hurry all the time. And we leave our appointment with the client thinking, okay, now I have to call the doctor and I have to get an order for occupational therapy and I'm going to talk to the nurse and I'm going to ask the nurse if she can ask the doctor for an OT visit and I'm going to ask that she use her home health agency of choice, et cetera, et cetera. What we've missed is an opportunity to coach Ms. Stevens through how to do that herself. And so for all of you who've ever sat in a client's home and done that with the client on the phone, on her phone, I'm clapping for you. You can't hear it, but I'm clapping. Because one of the kindest things and the most educational things that you can do with clients is to share with them how to carry those tasks out. Now, they may not be ready to carry out all those steps at that moment. You may say to a client, now, what I think you need to do is let's think about this. If you were to call your doctor, what would you say to the nurse at the front desk? How would you ask for this? they may not be able to conceptualize doing that at that point. But if you sit in the home and you do it in front of them, then what you're doing is you're teaching that individual how to do it and how to be competent with it in the future, whether or not you're available, whether or not you're there. And that really points to this last slide that we're talking about, is that the most effective tools that you can use are when you assign tasks, that you assign as many as are humanly possible to the client, him or herself, or the family members. You might assign things like interviewing potential service providers in order to select one. You might assign things like calling the doctor's office to ask for an order for something. The example that I gave a minute ago, where you'd sit in the client's home and in front of her you would actually call the doctor's office, is a shared task, because you're going to assign some of those aspects to her, and you're going to have completed some of them yourself as the care manager before you leave the home. Finally, probably the least effective option is that the care manager performs the tasks herself. Now, I understand that often in the real world you've got to do that, because you're going to find that either clients or family members are sometimes unable, sometimes they lack the cognitive capacity, sometimes they are, quite honestly, not psychologically prepared to engage in this activity, and sometimes they're just not going to be willing to. And your goal is going to be to work with them in any of those opportunities. And so we need to be realistic about this. But at a minimum, you should be engaging the individual in trying to do some of these things, him or herself. Again, because that's your method for building on future problem-solving skills. This is your opportunity. The other thing that I want you to think about is when you're working harder than the client is, you need to redetermine a couple of things. You need to reevaluate the client's capacity for active involvement. The other thing is you need to redetermine whether or not the goals are actually your goals or their goals. Because someone who doesn't feel engaged in the goals, the ultimate goals, is not going to be willing to provide a whole lot of effort or they're not going to sweat in terms of trying to carry these things out. And so you might ask yourself, when you're working harder than the client is this my issue? Have I developed goals that are important to me but really are meaningless to the individual, and so they're not engaging with me in toward meeting that goal? Or is the person just not able to? And sometimes it's a little bit of both. So you're always asking for the relevance of the goal with the client. Now, there are a lot of us who like to actually assign tasks between our visits. So we might leave clients with a list of resources or potential resources and say, I'm going to call you in a week, and then we'll check back in about how easy or how hard you found that to contact these resources. And sometimes if you've checked back in a week and then a week later, you're going to go back to your problem-solving method of trying to decide whether or not the individual can't or isn't or just is not engaged in calling the resources. And so that is essentially what I would say to you, is that this is a constant evaluation process. And that every step of the way, from assessment to developing a plan of care, interviewing the individual, evaluating with the individual how well things are working or not working, it is a process that is ever evolving. And it's like a relationship. You know the person a little bit when you first meet them, but as time goes on, this relationship grows. And you're learning a little bit more about that individual every time you interact with them. So that's really all of the formal presentation that I have. And let's open it up now to see if you all have any conversation about this. If you want to agree or disagree or give us some examples, I'm open to that.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Catherine. We still have a little time left, so if anyone would like to type in a question for Catherine or a comment or just something that you want to throw out there to the group, this is your chance. And what I'm going to do right now is I am going to forward the slide to the link for the Survey Monkey so that when we do stop recording and shut down, this will automatically pop up for you. And if you are not at your own desk, remember to copy down that link that you can do the post-test in a little bit. So right now we're just waiting to see if anyone has any questions. And while we're waiting, I want to tell you a few things that are coming ahead. On February the 11th, we will do a webinar on using technology, and this is going to hopefully help individuals with dementia and their families in the homes. And then also on March the 5th, we will have a part 2 to the Don R. And then we're going to take a little break for April, May, and then in June, we will have a webinar on Wednesday, June the 4th for depression versus dementia. Okay, we do have a couple questions, Catherine.
Okay.
Kristen, if a client does not engage in any goals, is it ever appropriate to ask whether client wants the support or to ask whether the client would like to discontinue the support service?
Absolutely. I think that in your trying to be a good steward of resources, it absolutely is appropriate to ask the client, what are your goals, and to continually ask that. And if the client just isn't able to engage in any goals, I think my next question would be, tell me what about this service you find helpful. Because if they're not able to identify any goals, you're either working with someone who is perhaps very apathetic, perhaps doesn't find the service useful, or perhaps is just too depressed to engage in any future thinking. Any of the above is a reasonable thing for you to check out. And certainly the latter is a very reasonable thing for you to check out. So yeah, I think that, again, the placing some responsibility on the client is exactly what we ought to be doing.
Okay, and that does go for the caregiver as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, and I hope I pronounced this name right. Benet, she asks, any questions for the negative Nellie client that refuses to do anything towards facilitating their own improved situation? And I think we all know a negative Nellie.
We absolutely do. Absolutely do. That's a great question, too. Benet, I think that a negative Nellie is resistant for any one of a number of reasons. And you might go ahead and check out with Nellie why she's resistant. If the individual, I'm going to read your question just a minute more and see if they just refuse to do anything toward improving their situation. Again, it's a case of you need to ask her to identify what her goals are. If negative Nellie says, well, my goal is just to be here until I die, and I hope that that happens pretty quickly, then what you know you're dealing with is someone who is extremely unhappy, who doesn't have any future thinking, and who you may need to check out for some pretty serious depression issues. If she says something to the contrary, like I've paid into the system, I don't think I should have to do anything, I think you need to bring services to me, then you're dealing with quite another matter, and at least you know what the impasse is. You know, if there's anything else that needs to be done to mitigate that negative behavior. Sometimes it's just a matter of breaking down what the tasks into little minute pieces that she is willing to do. Even the littlest thing, like picking up the phone and calling the company to say, this attendant is not working out for me. Can you send me somebody else? That's a little thing, but in some ways for a negative Nellie, it's going to be a big thing. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay. Melanie has kind of a two-part question.
Okay.
First, what is an appropriate way for a family member or other provider to engage the care manager if the third party is seeing problems with the client? Then she says the care plan is in place, but the client is not able or the goals are not being reached, so maybe an adjustment to the plan would help?
Absolutely. I think because this is an evolving process, we may often set up plans of care that are overreaching. We may often set up plans of care that we believe are going to work, but just don't for whatever reason. And in that case, if there's a third party involved, I would hope that that third party would go back to the care manager and say, this is what we're seeing, and we don't really think that this is the intended outcome for this plan of care. Can we engage the client or engage together in trying to figure out about another goal or another way to accomplish this?
Okay. All right, now we have Barbara. And Barbara, I got to tell you, your question's kind of tugging on my heartstrings. Mm-hmm. What about the client that truly needs services, doesn't have mental or educational capacity to comprehend, and does not have a caregiver or family?
That sort of flies in the face of the strengths perspective, it seems, doesn't it? But I would say to you that if the client truly needs services and you've evaluated their capacity and they just don't have the cognitive capacity to carry that out and to be an active participant in the planning process, then that's when you have to say, oh, well, I need to do this myself. I need to set these services up. And by the way, this is someone who probably is not going to be able to be a really good steward of their own services. So I'm going to need to put that person high on my list for checking up, for following up with the services and with him or her to make absolutely sure that things are going well. Because this is typically not the kind of person who's going to be a very good consumer of services. So they may not see a care aide for several days, but this person is probably not going to call you and complain or ask for anything. So this is someone where you have to sort of throw everything out of the window in terms of best practice and say, you know, I understand that I'd really like to engage her and I'd like for her to call the service provider, but her history tells me that she's not capable of doing that, so I need to do that for her.
Okay. All right. Is there any other questions out there? They were good questions.
We
appreciate
questions.
It. And we'll give it a couple more seconds here. Yeah, I appreciate everything.
Thank you all very much for joining us. It's been great. Thank you so much.
Yes, and if I've never said it before, we appreciate everything that everyone does out there.
Yes.
We know it's a tough job, and like I said, some of the questions, they kind of tug on me.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah.
So
thank you all for the work you do.
Yes.
Thanks so much. And thanks, Elaine, for the opportunity.
No, and thank you, Catherine.
Okay.
All right, at this time I'm going to stop the recording, and when I shut down, your post-test should pop up. Thank you much, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Please stand by.